I tell you a joke, and I tell you that up front in case it's not funny. I'm hoping for a little help. But it's an old one, so you may have heard it, but it's a truck driver is having his meal at a truckside restaurant, and these motorcycle types come in, and they're kind of kicking chairs and storming around, and they push him around a little bit, and he's sitting at the bar minding his own business, and they decide they want his spot, and they sort of roughly shove him around and make his life miserable and use words that are inappropriate to repeat here. And finally, they just sort of shove him on out, and he throws his money down and leaves, and they sit around, kind of scratch and laugh and say, well, guess we showed him he wasn't much of a man. And the waitress says, well, he's not much of a truck driver either. He just ran over 4 motorcycles out there. So, have you heard that one? I don't know. It's kind of an old one. But I like that story to get us oriented to this morning's thinking, because this morning we're going to talk a lot about justice and retribution and what that means. And I think that's where our minds go, at least mine and maybe yours. I think that's where a lot of our stories go is, well, he did this to me, so I'll do that to him, or they did this to me, so we'll do that to them. And I think that kind of thinking cannot get us very far. It's old thinking, it's old school. Scholars talk about something maybe even older than the Old Testament, the Hammurabi's Code that talked about an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and this is echoed all through, even down to today. It's foundational to some degree still to what we talk about when we talk about loss and repair. But these kind of assumptions about rightness and retribution, I think, are what Jesus is at least lifting up to us to reconsider, at least as far as our interpersonal relationships go, at least as far as we go as people. We hear it, Reverend Bill and I talked in advance of this service today saying that there's a bit of an embarrassment of riches today, because even in the Leviticus, did you hear the echo of the love your neighbor as yourself? Did you hear that at the very end when he read this morning? I mean, that's where Jesus, we talk about the two great, the golden rule, the 2 commandments, the golden rule, love your neighbor as yourself and love your Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. So here it is in Leviticus, the Old Testament. Jesus is effectively quoting that later. So we have this call coming forward. Now, specifically in our reading this morning in the Matthew 5, and remember Matthew 5 is the Sermon on the Mount. So this is Jesus' largest single sermon. He does several, but we're working our way through. And here he starts, you have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Again, that echo of that Hammurabi Code, that ancient language of even fair repayment at times. But Jesus is trying to get us to think beyond that, to think through that, to something else, to move away from the sense of revenge, to watch out for the temptation to somehow ourselves be judge, jury, executioner, to accept that revenge becomes or can become its own problem. That somehow when our hearts only are invested in that kind of payment and repayment, that we become smaller somehow spiritually, emotionally, and that's even a dangerous path to go down. I was reminded of the great book Moby Dick, you know, the story of the sailor, Captain Ahab, who has lost a leg, and he sets out on effectively a quest for revenge after the great white whale, the elusive white whale. You know, it's an exciting read, maybe some of you read it, know the story anyway. And of course, the sad thing is it becomes this all-consuming thing that effectively kills the whale and the captain and most everyone else along. There's no revenge is sweet here. There's simply sadness and a poison which created this cycle of despair and collapse, and we see at the end just this very devastated story. So Jesus would redeem us from ourselves, would pull us away from such pursuits, and be reminded that there is a lot more to life, and there's a different way to live, and to live it, if you will, richly. It's a hard read. I say to you, do not resist the evildoer. If anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. Wow. I don't want to hear that. I don't want to do that necessarily. If someone struck me on the right cheek, I could just see my blood pressure spike. My face would turn, not from the slap, my ears get red when I get mad. I can imagine. But Jesus is saying, there's really something else altogether going on here. It's about how we respond to the problem of life. It's how we respond to those around us. I hear too often the phrase, "You made me mad," from a lot of people in my life. People I speak to, people I know, maybe you hear the same phrase, and I want to say, no. They did something, perhaps even very irritating and wrong. But our response is ours. And sometimes we just multiply the mistake by becoming mad ourselves and allowing ourselves to get swept away in that moment. There's a conversation even about if you were struck on your right cheek, that it was the backhand of the right hand, since it was right-handed culture, and I don't know. There's another one coming. I think the point is that Jesus is inviting us to think about different ways of being. That somehow when we invite that kind of retributive anger and even potential violence into ourselves, that we become then that kind of angry, violent person. And Jesus is saying perhaps stepping away from that is certainly a different way to live and maybe better. Well, he's not saying maybe. He's illustrating how non-retaliation works. If we try to make a law out of that illustration, I think we miss the point. I heard a tale of a woman, a friend of mine in seminary, who liked to jog. And she would run around our seminary in the streets they're in most days, 3 or 4 days a week. And one day while she was out jogging, it wasn't particularly late or anything, but someone ran up to her and grabbed her. And this was particularly scary, a woman alone, jogging, someone from behind grabbing her. And her response, instead of, and not to dismiss these other responses, but rather than become violent in response, she threw up her hands and said, "I am a child of God." And she fell to her knees, which did two things. One, she actually effectively slipped this guy's grip, right? Because, she slipped to the ground and on her knees. And two, I think he maybe wondered if he'd gotten a hold of more than he could handle. I don't know. But he ran away. She was safe. But I love that story for a lot of reasons, mostly because my friend was unharmed, but also, at least part of why she was unharmed is that she came at that problem from a completely different perspective. I don't know of anybody besides practicing believers who would have perhaps thought to respond that way. "I am a child of God." I mean, good heavens. But it worked. It worked. How do we respond? How do we respond when we're slapped in the face? I'm not great at this. This is not my greatest gift. It's part of why I decided to talk about it today. I thought, well, let's give it a go. Here it is. It's in the Bible. Well, if we're going to read it and we're going to believe it, we got to think about it. Got to talk about it. I think we should also point out that, Jesus goes on. The slap, okay, it's a response, our response. But Jesus goes on. He gives other examples. If anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. Well, there's been a lot of study and writing about this, and one thing they say is that everyone in Jesus' day, Jews at least in this community, would have had this kind of, what's the first word there? Cloak. Your coat, your cloak. Now, those words are almost the same in English, aren't they? Coat and cloak. But they would have had sort of a basic outfit, a shift, we used to call it in old style English. And so to give that away was maybe not easy, but everyone from the poorest person on up would have had that. But a coat was separate, was even safe from legal proceedings. You could take everything a man had legally, but not his coat, because it would double as a blanket and things. And so Jesus is really pushing us to give away more even than the law, to be at risk, if you will, in our response, to take a chance. on ourselves and on the humanity of the person we're dealing with. What he's suggesting is that we go further than the law requires, that we go further than judge, jury, and plaintiff, that we look for something different in our response to the world. Jesus goes on to say, if someone compels you to carry a pack for 1 mile, go a second. Now, compel, even in our day, has a sense of being made to do something. To compel someone to do something is to be made to do something you probably don't want to do. But certainly in Jesus' day, when they were an occupied people from a foreign power, Roman power ruled the day, they were compelled to do a lot of things. As someone said, think about Simon and Cyrene being compelled to carry the cross. I mean, they understood that word very closely and personally. So to say that Jesus was really getting into their hardest place, because to be occupied was then and now a very painful situation. So to be compelled then, they understood what that meant. So he was saying, if you're being compelled to do something, go ahead and do more. Go ahead and do it even greater. And on the face of that, that sounds maybe a little absurd, maybe a little silly. But one writer had said this to say, go ahead and do what you're forced to do it with good grace. He said, the first mile is duty, the second mile is opportunity. And I've thought a lot about that. What is the opportunity? What is the chance? Well, the chance is to show that person something different. The chance is to show even yourself, or at least in yourself, to live out something a little differently. The chance, the opportunity becomes that we ourselves have lived differently in the face of tough situations. To be in a position where you were compelled to do something meant someone had power over you that you simply couldn't avoid. But you lived through that differently. You acted differently in the face of being compelled in a way that is, we'll say, Christian. Let's see. And then here we have, you have heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Now that's an interesting situation. Pray for those who persecute you. And of course, what the story goes on, Jesus goes on to say, but, I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He makes the sun rise on the evil and the good, the rain on the righteous and unrighteous. And then really very challenging questions. If you only love those who love you, what have you done? If you only greet your brothers and sisters, what are you really doing? So, what does that mean? How do we love or pray for our enemies? Well, I think this is one of the most misunderstood series of passages in the Bible, and certainly perhaps one of the most famous, because I think it makes Christians come across as weak or spineless, and I don't think that's fair or accurate. But I do think that Jesus is putting forth potentials for us to be different in the world, for us to light and reflect and to live in a way that is perhaps even unique in the world, and gives us, in those opportunities, our witness. The witness of action, maybe the witness of conversation if we get the chance. I take this story from a man named James Moore, who tells of two farmers living side by side, and one day, Farmer A. I started to make up names, but every time I do that, it gets me in trouble, so we'll just say this farmer over here. His cow got out and trampled the garden down of the other farmer, and this farmer was very mad and upset. And he storms over and he says, come get your animal out of mine, come repair the fence. And the man does, and he says, and you owe me this much for the damage done to my crop. And the man pays him. And of course, in the way of cosmic comedy or whatever, a few days later, this opposite happens. This man's cow breaks out, stomps on the garden. And of course, the second farmer, is concerned. So when he sees the first farmer, when he sees the man that he had already challenged, he says, I suppose the damages you have figured, and go ahead and tell me what they are. And the first man says, you don't owe me a thing. He says, we're neighbors, and I'd rather lose the garden than your friendship. And see, that's a completely different way to respond. He had every right to say, your cow did this much damage to my garden, you owe me whatever, and that's even fair. It's not necessarily a bad thing to do. But it was a surprising thing to do. It was something that caught him off guard, particularly in the context of this argument they'd had just a few days before, particularly in light of where they were, if you will, in their friendship. And it puts the relationship above really all other matters, the economics of it. It reminds us of that phrase, love your neighbor as yourself. It's not always easy to love our neighbor. Neighbors, A, we don't always get to pick, and B, aren't always gracious. Sometimes the ones we pick we don't end up liking. Neighbors are funny things. And the story goes on that later that night there was a knock at the first man's door, and his neighbor stood there with the money he'd already given, saying, take this money back. I need to change my way of looking at things, and maybe this will get me started. See, there's the witness. There's the opportunity. There's the light not being hidden under a bushel basket. There's the possibility to change the world, if you will, one neighbor at a time. The first man was at least willing to try to learn how to live differently in light of the second man, in light of his friend's action. And it's important, I think, at some point to say that this is not self-righteousness, but God's righteousness. I think sometimes we take it into ourselves in a way that just makes us prideful. And I don't think that's the call either. I think the call is to try to live life differently in a way that makes us different, makes our results different, but because of God's leadership, because of God's witness, because of God's willingness to do all things differently, including someone full of power and might, standing in obedience and servitude even unto the cross. Is this teaching that Jesus calls us to too hard, too difficult? I hope not. I think I'm better for having tried. I think I'm better for the times I've lived into something unique and different. I know I'm better for the times that I have seen it reflected back, sometimes from the model I've set, sometimes from the models of others, but always in the name of the Lord. And it is that hopeful moment that keeps me here and keeps me coming and keeps me trying. Keeps me invested in being Christian, keeps me wanting to be a better man, a better husband and father, a better minister and friend, a better neighbor to you and to others, to this world. Because together, I think there is a whole new potential in God's name. Amen.